And so my question in this discussion that we were having around this water and sanitation work is, why can't we just focus on these sorts of results, on making these sorts of changes in institutions, changes in people's capacity? And part of the issue comes around to them being more tricky to measure, harder to grab onto, that they're not so quantifiable, people don't relate to them so easily, and they feel kind of fluffy. And yet we have to get past that because they are the intermediate outcomes that lead to the end result that we're looking for. And an additional related issue is that also comes up from this pressure to have results kind of too quickly, is that we lose sight of the long-term impacts. So I had a discussion with a leading person in, again, the water and sanitation field, worldwide leader in this area, has worked in this sector all his life, and I was raising an issue around environmental concerns and longer-term impacts. And his response was, but people are dying now. We have to act now, and we don't have time to consider those longer-term implications. We have to act for them now. And my response was, well, we can't afford to wait and to think of those things later. We have to take responsibility for the type of infrastructure that we're, for instance, proposing in an urban area. And we know that, for instance, large-scale systems are going to create an enormous debt and a massive expense to maintain in the future. And we also know that the environmental outcomes for that of displacing nutrients to where we don't want them to be, we know that that's not the right way to go. We've been through that learning cycle already in developed countries. So my response was, we need to take responsibility now. We can't wait and think about that later and make a change that will impact on people's lives in a way that in the end is detrimental. So my point here is that we need to give much more emphasis to the necessary, intermediary, and much less tangible types of outcomes. And we need to value them. We need to see them as legitimate and to track progress in them. And we need to take responsibility for the longer-term effects of the different sorts of paths to development that we choose. And finally, my third point, which is about change. Cynthia's standing up. Okay. So in these photos, you see some different things where change is needed. And here I want to just mention one of the management tools which is used in the aid industry, which is about, and it's called a log frame, and any development worker will they'll know exactly what I'm talking about. But for those of you in the public, it's a tool that plans an aid initiative and treats it as though it's a linear progression of you do something, you have a reaction, and something that you plan to happen will happen. And that will lead to another thing happening. And the thing is, most development workers come to really hate these. They're written down at the outset of a project, but you find once an aid initiative has started, they just bear no resemblance to reality because so many other different sorts of things come up. And so quite recently, working with an international NGO, they were working on a program to reduce the risk of avian influenza. A fairly typical NGO model of working at the community level, working through training, working through volunteers, and it all looks fine on paper when you start off. But then what you take one step into it and you find so many complexities. The volunteers they train, they find that they can't and they won't go ahead and do the sorts of jobs that the NGO is hoping of them, and they either may, in some cases, wanted to be paid or needed to be paid to legitimise that work, or perhaps didn't have the status in the communities to be able to do it. And similarly, the NGO had been very good in that it had made sure that women were participating and were some of these volunteers, but then they found that those women didn't have the confidence to go and to run health education sessions in different villages where they lived. They didn't feel that they would be respected and heard, and so they weren't going to be a viable medium for passing on messages. So what my point here is that we need to pose more questions about what we do, and we need to be more flexible in allowing different organisations who work in the sector to respond to the complexity, so to not be stuck to that initial plan which is done when you haven't really understood the actual situation. And so to reiterate the three key messages I gave, it's about how do we do aid better. We need to reflect on and acknowledge our intent. We need to rethink about the focus and the timescale and make the two actually match. And one of my messages to you as citizens is to make sure that you, when you donate or even when you think of your tax money, that you don't demand the wrong outcomes too soon, because that just means that politicians and NGOs and donors, we have to run around trying to present as though we're getting to those outcomes very quickly, and that's sending us on the wrong track. And so that's where I see your role to understand the complexity of what we're dealing with in this sector. And my third point about engaging genuinely with complexity. And so I finish with saying again that aid does and can work, and we can also do it better, and that sustainable change will come from the right kind of intent, the right kind of focus and timescale, and having those two match, and the right means. And I'd like to close with a story of a woman in Peru who I interviewed while doing an evaluation there. It was of a project which was related to nutrition and changes in agricultural practice. And what she came back to me with was a complete changed life perspective. So through this project, even though perhaps her child didn't weigh more, and if you were just to measure whether the child weighed more, you might not have found that the project was successful. But what she came back and said was that what the project had done for her was to realise that she could learn new things. And in learning new things, she could change her future. And that's a pretty big change to have created. And for me, the joy in doing this sort of work is contributing to changes like that. Thank you.